A woman was found dead in her own home. Police started investigating and immediately found several concerning leads. The longer they looked into the case, the more strange and terrifying details surfaced. After several years, they finally uncovered the truth, but nobody expected such a turn of events. Karen Gregory was born on March 29, 1948 in Albany, New York. She was the eldest of 4 children and helped her parents take care of her siblings from a young age. The girl was into sports and spent a lot of time in nature. Additionally, she loved art and wanted to work in that field. After finishing high school, Karen enrolled in Nazareth College in Rochester, where she received a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science degrees. After that, she worked as an art teacher in an elementary school for several years and then decided to become a graphic designer. In 1983, when she was 35 years old, she moved to Florida where she met a man named David McKee. He worked as a manager in an organization that provided consulting services to Vietnam veterans, and he and Karen quickly became mutually attracted. The couple dated for just over a year, and in the spring of 1984, David asked her to move in with him in Gulfport. Before this, Karen lived in an apartment with her friend, and she constantly had to drive to David's house. The woman accepted this offer and began gradually moving her things there. On May 22nd, Karen took the remaining items from her apartment and finally moved out completely. She told her neighbor that she was a little nervous. David had gone to another state for work to speak at a conference, and she would have to spend a whole week alone in his house. From the apartment, the woman went to her friend's house. They had a great time there. Karen told her friend that she was very happy with David and was glad she would finally be living with him. The friends talked until about midnight, after which Karen went to David's house. The next day, he called home several times, but no one answered. He thought Karen might have stayed in her old apartment and called her neighbor, but the woman said she hadn't seen her since yesterday. After that, David called several of Karen's friends and her sister, but none of them had seen her. He continued to try to reach her all day, but he never got an answer. On the next day, May 24th, David called home again early in the morning, hoping to catch Karen before she left for work, but there was still no answer. Later, he called her boss and found out that she had not shown up for work. At this point, David's concern reached its peak and he feared that something bad may have happened to Karen. He then called local hospitals and police stations to inquire if they had seen anyone matching Karen's description. Upon learning that they had not, he decided to call his neighbor, Amy. David asked her, "Is Karen's car parked in front of the house?" Amy looked out the window and replied, "Yes." This only added to David's worry. He asked Amy to go to the house and knock on the door. He was so anxious that he stayed on the line with her until she left to fulfill his request. Amy approached the side door and knocked, but there was no answer. She then walked around the house and saw that one of the windows was open. She called out Karen's name several times, but there was no response. She extended her arm through the open window, pulled back the curtain, and was shocked by what she saw. The window was in the bedroom, and through it she could see the hallway where a bloodied female body lay on the floor. Amy couldn't see the face because she was behind a wall. She knew it was likely Karen. After recovering from the shock, Amy ran back to her own house where David was still on the phone. She grabbed the phone and told him that something terrible had happened before hanging up and calling 911. Doctors quickly arrived at the scene but were only able to confirm Karen's death. Detectives began investigating the crime scene, which horrified even experienced police officers. Based on the amount of blood throughout the house, Karen had fought her attacker until the end. Bloodstains led from the hallway to the front door, where several fragments of glass had been smashed. Detectives noticed several strands of hair matching Karen's hair color stuck in the broken glass. They theorized that she had almost made it outside but was caught by her attacker. In the bathroom, investigators found their first lead: a bloody footprint on the floor. Police checked Karen's feet and found no bloodstains, so the footprint must have belonged to her killer. However, it was unclear why the killer was walking around barefoot in the bathroom. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that she had received about 20 stab wounds and had been subjected to violence. Before we continue, I have a small request for you. We've created a new channel where we upload content related to old, historical ruins and interesting events. So, if you're interested, kindly subscribe to my channel, Decoverize, for daily interesting videos and show some love in the comments. I'll read every one of your comments. The link is in the description. Experts also extracted biological material from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not used in 1984, so this clue could not help to identify the killer. In addition, several bloody fingerprints were found on her body, but they were too smeared to be used. According to experts, the woman was killed about 30 hours before she was discovered. This meant that she was attacked on the same night when she returned home from her friend's place. There was another detail that immediately caught the attention of the police and doctors as soon as they saw Karen's body. She was wearing a shirt and a lace corset was on top of it. Apparently, the perpetrator did this. When the police finished examining the crime scene and collected all possible clues, they allowed Karen's friends to start cleaning up. The women did not want David to see all this horror. When he arrived, all the victim's acquaintances knew how much he loved her and wanted to ease his suffering at least a little. David's conference was taking place on the other side of the country, so he needed a lot of time to return home. Meanwhile, the detectives began questioning the neighbors. This area was considered quite prestigious and safe, and the crime rate was extremely low. Many residents knew each other, and they even had a neighborhood watch. This is a form of agreement between neighbors when they keep an eye on order and report any suspicious things to the police. However, in this case, the neighborhood watch did not perform its functions. Detectives found out that on May 23rd, at around 1:15 a.m., 16 residents of the area heard a piercing female scream, and none of them called the police. They all said the scream quickly stopped and they did not get the impression that someone could be in danger. Even the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite the victim, did not consider it necessary to call the police. He was fixing his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio when he heard a muffled scream. The man walked down the street and did not notice anything suspicious, after which he returned back. A neighbor who lived opposite David shared an interesting observation. On the morning of May 23rd, she saw that the front door of his house was open, and she also heard a scream that night but did not associate it with the open door. In her story, there was one detail: when the police called, the door was locked. Considering that the body had been in the house for about 30 hours, the culprit could have returned and tried to cover his tracks, including closing the door. It was noteworthy that there were no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator may have climbed in through the back window, but there were also no signs of forced entry there. Either Karen left it open all night, or she knew the killer and let him in herself. The head of the neighborhood watch shared another interesting observation with the detectives. On the evening of the day after Karen's murder, an unknown man pulled up to her house. He got out of the car, knocked on the door a few times, and kept looking around. Then he returned to the car, but a few minutes later, he came back with a piece of paper in his hand. He placed it on Karen's car windshield and only then drove away. The police immediately checked the car and indeed found a note on the windshield that said, "Karen and David, hi, I stopped by around 7:15 p.m. but didn't see any signs of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back, but I have what you asked for." The detectives immediately noticed the wording, "no signs of life." Given that at the time this person arrived, Karen had been dead for almost a whole day. Such a choice of words was very alarming. The note ended with the name Peter, and investigators tried to find him. It turned out that he had been right under their noses the whole time. The man learned about it from Karen's former neighbor and came to their house. The man cooperated actively and answered all the questions. He voluntarily provided his fingerprints and footprints and also told them what he was doing near the victim's house. According to Peter, a few days before this, Karen called him and invited him and David to dinner. But there was one detail: that David would also be there, even though at the time he was already scheduled to go on a week-long business trip. The detectives also asked Peter what he meant in the note by the phrase, "I have what you asked for." The man said he borrowed a cassette from them and was planning to return it. Another strange detail was that Peter allegedly did not notice the glass shards almost all over the path to the front door, let alone the several broken windows. The man insisted that he hadn't seen anything or paid attention to it. During the conversation with him, one of the detectives noticed a large cut on Peter's hand. When the police officer looked at his hand, the man covered the spot and said that he always gets scratches after playing with dogs or repairing his car. All of the above looked extremely suspicious, and the detectives decided to check his alibi. Peter said that on the night of the murder, he was sleeping at home, and his neighbor confirmed this. The police didn't rush to exclude him from the list of suspects since such an alibi could easily be a lie. However, the investigators quickly came up with another suspect: David, Karen's boyfriend. According to his words, that night he was in Rhode Island, which is located 2,000 kilometers away from his home, and he was sleeping in his hotel room. But at the crime scene, the police found a very interesting clue. A local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23rd, the same day Karen was killed. It was very strange, and the detectives began to wonder if David could have flown to Florida, killed his girlfriend, and returned before his next conference appearance. They calculated the flight and travel times from airports and concluded that it was indeed possible. Additionally, no one could confirm David's alibi for that night since he allegedly slept alone in his hotel room. The head of the neighborhood watch also shared his observations. He had repeatedly noticed that Karen and David argued when the woman came to his house. David, on the other hand, insisted that they had a wonderful relationship and the couple hardly ever fought. When David was asked about the newspaper, he said he bought it on May 21st at a store near his home. He was going to take it with him on the trip to have the weather forecast for the week. They sold that newspaper. He even remembered that David bought it on the 21st. According to the clerk, the publication actually released that issue several days ago, which is normal for printed newspapers. Thus, suspicions against David faded into the background. They asked him if anything was missing from her house, and the man noticed the absence of a white lace corset that Karen had bought for herself a few months earlier, one very similar to the one worn by Karen's killer. This immediately led the detectives to think that the depraved criminal had taken it as a trophy. The police decided to pursue another lead found in the victim's house. A high-quality drawing of a watch signed with the name Stephen Fischler. One particular detail caught the detectives' attention. The paper appeared to be covered in blood. The detectives quickly discovered that Stephen worked with Karen in the same company and questioned her colleagues. They uncovered a lot of interesting information. Almost all the employees said that Stephen was a rather strange person. He persistently tried to court all the female colleagues, shared pictures with them depicting perverted things, and even tried to get a little bit of a sense of humor. And even wrote a perverted poem and tried to persuade his colleagues to read it. All the women who worked with him admitted that Stephen scared them. Karen also complained several times about his behavior, but management didn't give it much thought. The detectives talked to him, and the man denied giving Karen that drawing. He also claimed that he barely knew the victim and offered to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. The investigators quickly organized such a test, and that's where the most interesting part began. At first, everything was calm, but after one of the questions, Stephen suddenly said that he killed Karen. Literally a few seconds later, he took his words back and said that he had nothing to do with it. What was strange was that in both cases, the polygraph operator did not detect a lie. This confused the detectives, but they couldn't rely on the polygraph results. This instrument is far from perfect and simply cannot accurately determine whether a person is lying or not. At the same time, they understood that Stephen was clearly a very strange person and could say anything. Soon, experts studied his drawing and concluded that the red stain on it was left by ketchup, not blood. As a result, that began to doubt whether Stephen was involved in Karen's murder. Despite such a number of suspects, the police still couldn't gather enough evidence against anyone, and the case remained unsolved for several months. Detectives continued to investigate, but they couldn't find any new leads. This continued until December when something interesting happened. One of the respected residents of Gulfport was retiring, and in honor of this event, local residents organized special events. Many people attended, including a woman named Mary who struck up a conversation with a police officer who was also present. During their conversation, they discussed the murder of Karen Gregory, and Mary inadvertently mentioned that she too had heard her piercing scream that night. The officer immediately noted one strange detail. Mary lived 2 blocks away from Karen's house, and initially the police didn't even interview residents of such distant houses. The fact that the woman heard the scream indicated that it was really very loud. However, the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite Karen's house, described it as muffled. But if the neighbors 2 blocks away heard it, the man clearly could not consider it quiet, especially since at that moment he was in his garage with the door open. All this raised doubts, but the police were not quick to suspect the head of the neighborhood watch. He was 22-year-old George Lewis. He worked as a firefighter and was a good friend of almost all the employees of the local police station. He lived with his wife and young child, and all the neighbors spoke of him as a reliable and decent person. Nevertheless, detectives could not ignore Mary's story. They called George and asked him to come to the station when he had time. The man agreed, but never showed up. It is worth noting that before this, he regularly stopped by the station just to chat with his friends. The chief detective in this case was even at his wedding, so it was difficult for him to imagine George as a killer. In January 1985, they managed to talk to him. George insisted that the scream did not seem very loud to him. Perhaps this was due to the music playing from the radio. The detective asked him if he remembered anything else from that night, but George told him the same thing, except for one moment. When his testimony was taken for the first time, he said that he heard the scream, went out of the garage, and walked down the street. But this time, he stated, he just walked up to the road, looked around, and then returned. Considering that many months had passed since then, this discrepancy in the testimonies did not seem serious. However, the police still decided to make sure that he was telling the truth and offered to undergo a polygraph test. George agreed, but to their surprise, he did not pass it. In a subsequent conversation with detectives, the man admitted that he had hidden one fact from them. He claimed that on the night Karen disappeared, he saw an unknown man near her house. George could only remember that the man was tall and had red hair and a beard. The detectives once again doubted whether he was telling the truth. George could not explain why he had not mentioned this man during the initial interview because the man knew where he lived and could harm his family. Despite this, the police tried to follow up on this lead and find the man, but the result was zero. Another nuance was that there was almost 30 meters between George and Karen's houses, and it was pitch dark outside. The detectives doubted that the man could see the color of another person's hair under such conditions, but George insisted on his story. Recreated the events of that night and asked George to describe the man who stood 30 meters away from him. He could not see any details, which made the detectives even more suspicious of his words. Nevertheless, they walked around the area and asked local residents, "Have you noticed a suspicious man with red hair who could walk on their streets at night?" To their surprise, several women admitted that they had occasionally seen a man who looking into their windows in the dark. None of them saw the face of this man, but one woman managed to notice him and, according to her, he looked very much like George Lewis. She was not 100% sure because it was dark outside and the man immediately ran away. George admitted that he did sometimes look into his neighbors' windows, but he insisted that he did it solely for their safety. He said he was just trying to make sure everything was okay with them since he was responsible for the security of his neighborhood as the head of the neighborhood watch. But all this only strengthened the suspicion against him. In March 1985, George agreed to a second polygraph test. This time he changed his story again. He admitted that not only did he see a man in front of Karen's house, but he also approached him to talk, and the man threatened to kill him if he told anyone about him. The polygraph operator once again detected a lie, so the investigator asked George directly, "Did he kill Karen Gregory?" The man answered negatively, and once again his words were considered false. Afterwards, the detectives decided to talk to George's wife, who told them that she had woken up that night from a piercing scream and was very frightened. She had tried to find her husband and went to the garage, but he was not there and the light in the garage was turned off. The woman then returned home and sat in the kitchen waiting for her husband, who only returned half an hour later. The detectives also decided to delve into George's biography and spoke with his ex-wife, who admitted that the man only seemed kind, caring, and responsible. In reality, he was very aggressive and raised his hand to her during frequent arguments. She added that he even choked her sometimes. Afterwards, the investigator spoke with George's close friends, who also shared some interesting information. Several months before the murder, when Karen was not yet living with him but periodically visited him, George told his friends that he liked her. Moreover, the detectives learned that the man sometimes participated in orgies and mentioned that he wanted Karen to join them. During these conversations with George's friends, the police also learned that in the summer of 1984, the man had a secret affair with a young woman who lived a few houses away from him. They spoke with her and learned something else. The young woman admitted that on her 17th birthday, George gave her a white lace corset. It was too big for her, but the man still made her wear it regularly. The police asked her to give them the corset and immediately showed it to Karen's boyfriend. He said that an identical corset had gone missing from the house and that its size matched Karen's. It was the first serious evidence against George. But the detectives continued to dig further. They took a footprint from him and sent it to FBI experts to compare it to the footprint found on the bathroom floor in Karen's house. After some time, the results came in. A complete match. In March 1986, George was called back to the police station and the detectives asked several times, was he in Karen's house on the night of the murder? The man denied it until the detective told him about the result of the examination. For the next few minutes, George continued to deny everything. But then he gave the police a new story. This time he said that he saw a red-haired man near Karen's house, then ran to her house and saw that everything around was bloody and the woman was lying in the hallway with a cut on her throat. Afterwards, he panicked and ran away from there, deciding never to remember that horror again. Of course, detectives didn't believe his story for a second because it sounded completely unbelievable. But George was right about one thing. There was indeed a cut on the victim's throat which hadn't been disclosed publicly. Even if his story was true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut due to the large amount of blood on Karen's body. At least experienced medical experts couldn't see it until the blood was washed away. This meant that George could only know about the cut if he was the killer. All of the above was enough to finally arrest the man. He was taken into custody on March 15th, almost 2 years after the murder in the state of Florida. He could have faced the death penalty for what he did. George's close friends and colleagues in the fire department didn't share the police's certainty that he was the killer. They still considered him a good person and made every effort to help him. These people gave part of their salary to George's wife and child and even raised $300,000 for bail. Several of his colleagues even mortgaged their homes. As a result, George was released in late December. He lived in his house for another 6 months and the trial didn't begin until June 4, 1987. George's lawyers insisted that the man hadn't killed anyone and never changed his version of events in conversations with the police. However, when the suspect was given the floor, he came up with a completely new story. Its beginning was the same. He saw a man near Karen's residence, ran into the house and saw her body. This sight made George very sick and he ran to the bathroom where he vomited. Apparently, this was how he tried to explain the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. But there was one obvious nuance here. If he had originally run into Karen's house barefoot, the bloody traces would have been from where he found her body to the bathroom. But they weren't there. When asked why he didn't call the police, George said that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too scared to tell anyone about it. It's worth noting that the man had been a firefighter since he was 18 and regularly dealt with horrific situations at work. But when he saw his dead neighbor, he suddenly couldn't even call the police. The prosecution insisted that George had feelings for Karen. For several months, he waited until her boyfriend left for a week and decided to take advantage of the situation. George broke into her house and attacked her. Although the woman managed to scream and even resist him, in the end he killed her and subjected her to violence. As for the footprint of his foot on the bathroom floor, there could be a simple explanation. Apparently, he tried to wash his clothes stained with Karen's blood in the bathroom and took off his shoes with socks, which also got blood on them. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. A month later, when his sentence was due to be announced, the judge suddenly scheduled a retrial. George's lawyers pushed for this, and they succeeded. They insisted that some evidence had been compromised by the police and the prosecution had not been able to fully prove their client's guilt. The judge's decision came as a shock to all participants in the process, as it rarely happens. However, the prosecutor was able to challenge this decision, and in 1989, it was overturned. In the end, George was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was ruled out because the man had no criminal history prior to the murder. Since then, George has tried to challenge his sentence several times but has been denied each time. Many of his friends and relatives continued to believe that he was innocent despite all the facts and evidence against him. George died in prison in 2014 at the age of 52. He insisted on his innocence until the very end and even gave an interview in which he talked about how difficult it was to bear the punishment for a crime he did not commit. In this whole story, one important point should be noted. 16 neighbors heard Karen scream, but none of them dared to call the police. Given that the police station was located near their street, the patrol could have arrived at the scene in a matter of minutes. The detectives who worked on this case admitted that in such a case, Karen's life could have been saved. But it did not happen. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoyed it. A woman in Australia left her home and disappeared without a trace, leaving her husband and 2 children behind. Relatives tried to contact her, but after several weeks of unsuccessful attempts, they decided to turn to the police. An investigation was conducted and it was concluded that the woman was not in danger and had the right to control her own fate. Since then, she has not contacted her family, and only 40 years later that they learned the shocking truth. Lynette Joy Dawson was born on May 5, 1948 in the Australian state of New South Wales. She grew up in a large, loving family with 2 brothers and a sister. Together with her parents, they lived in the small town of Clovelly, which is essentially a suburb of Sydney. Lynette was a cheerful child, had many friends, and always tried to help her loved ones. Her parents decided to send her to Sydney Girls High School, believing it would be the best choice for her. The school often held events in conjunction with Sydney Boys High School. And in 1965, at one of these events, Lynette met a boy named Chris Dawson. They were both 16 years old, and soon the couple began dating. After finishing school, Lynette decided to pursue a career in medicine. She wanted to help people, so she chose to become a nurse. At the same time, she took a part-time job at a childcare center. When Chris and Lynette were 21, they decided to get married. The couple got married in 1970. The newlyweds moved to the northern suburb of Sydney called Bayview, where the woman got a job at a local hospital. Chris was actively involved in sports and played professional rugby since 1972. He had a twin brother named Paul, with whom they were in the same sports team. Later, they both decided to end their professional careers and became physical education coaches at one of the Sydney schools. Chris and Lynette dreamed of a large family, but they struggled to conceive for a long time. After 6 years of unsuccessful attempts, they began to consider adopting a child from an orphanage, but Lynette finally became pregnant. The couple had their first daughter, followed by their second. Lynette and Chris were happy to finally have children. Their family seemed exemplary to friends and acquaintances, but soon the first signs of trouble began to appear in this idyllic picture. Lynette's friends started to notice bruises and injuries on her body periodically. When asked about it, Lynette claimed that it was nothing serious and her friends shouldn't worry about it. Lynette's friends were concerned for her, but they didn't see what was happening as something truly terrible. In those days, domestic violence wasn't considered a serious crime in the eyes of a significant portion of society in Australia. Moreover, everyone who knew Chris considered him a loving husband and caring father who never showed signs of aggression and was a positive person, and hoped that the couple would solve their problems. But the relationship between Lynette and Chris only continued to deteriorate. Lynette noticed that her husband had cooled towards her and was worried about the future of their family. A few years after the birth of their daughters, they decided to use the services of a nanny. Chris suggested this job to one of his 15-year-old school students, Bev McNally. But she didn't stay in this part-time job for long. She witnessed Chris raising his hand to Lynette twice and decided to leave. After this, Chris offered this job to another of his 16-year-old students, Joanne Curtis. After some time, Joanne had problems in her family and Chris offered her to stay with them for some time so she could spend more time looking after the children until the situation in her family improved. Despite her kindness and desire to help people, Lynette was against this. She was deeply concerned about the problems in their own family and didn't want someone else to be constantly present in their home. However, Chris insisted on it, and in October 1981, Joanne moved in with them. The young woman lived with them for about a month until Lynette discovered that her husband was sleeping with Joanne. It was a real shock for her and another blow to their marriage. She kicked Joanne out of the house but decided not to divorce Chris. Lynette wanted to keep their family together for the sake of their children, and she continued to love her husband despite his actions. Just a few months later, on December 3, 1981, Lynette faced yet another shock. Chris left her a note saying that he was leaving the family. He wrote that he would move to another city with Joanne and asked his wife not to portray him in a bad light to the children. Lynette was devastated by this news, but a few days later she was surprised again. Chris returned home because Joanne changed her mind about avoiding him in another city and asked to be taken back. Meanwhile, Chris spent New Year's Eve with Joanne, leaving his wife alone with the children. At that time, Joanne moved into Chris's brother's house, which was on the same street. Despite everything that was happening, Lynette wanted to keep their family together no matter what, so she decided to enroll in family therapy. Chris was against this idea, but she managed to convince him. She went to see the specialist right after New Year's, and it seemed that the therapy had a positive effect on their relationship. Chris started to spend more time with his wife and showed a desire to fix everything. On January 8, 1982, Lynette called her mother and told her that the family therapy was going well. They also agreed to meet with her and other relatives at the local beach the next day, and her mother thought that her daughter's speech sounded a bit unclear, as if Lynette was drunk. The woman explained that Chris had prepared some alcoholic drink for her. The next day, the relatives were waiting for Lynette on the beach, but she never showed up. They called her at home, and Chris said that he had driven his wife to the bus stop that morning. She was going to the store to return some clothes that didn't fit. However, she never returned home, and her relatives began to worry. In the evening, Chris called Lynette's mother and told her that his wife had contacted him by phone. She said that because of the problems in their marriage, she had decided to be away from home for a while and gather her thoughts. Her relatives thought that what was happening was strange, as they were aware of the problems that had been building up between the spouses for years, but they still couldn't imagine Lynette leaving her 2 daughters. She loved her children more than anything in the world and never mentioned considering the possibility of going somewhere. Days passed, but Lynette still didn't contact her family, which only added to their worry. On January 12th, Chris reported that Lynette had called their home phone and said that she was okay. Since then, he had spoken to her a few more times and told her relatives that she had been using her bank card. Despite this, her family continued to doubt that Lynette was okay. She didn't know how to drive and didn't take any items that she might need for living. She even left behind cash that was hidden in case of an emergency. 3 weeks later, Lynette's eldest daughter started 1st grade as the school year in Australia begins in January. But Lynette missed this event, which caused even more concern for her relatives. They were practically certain that something bad had happened to her. While Chris said that she continued to regularly call home, and the last such call was at the end of January. Since then, Lynette hadn't been in contact. On February 18th, 6 weeks after Lynette left home, her husband went to the police. He filed a missing person report and expressed suspicion that amid all the problems in their marriage, Lynette could have joined some religious organization or even a cult. Her relatives denied such a possibility, as Lynette was not religious and didn't attend church. The police began a search, but they had absolutely no leads. Lynette's mother and other members of her family were certain that she would never leave home, abandoning her daughters, so they believed that she had been kidnapped where some other tragedy had occurred. Despite this, the police concluded that Lynette had indeed left home, as they had no evidence of the contrary. They tried to find her for some time and then stopped the investigation. Chris posted a message for Lynette in a local newspaper calling for her to come home. He wrote that he loved her and was eagerly awaiting her call. He also called all of her friends, trying to find any information about his wife's whereabouts. Despite Chris's eagerness to find Lynette, he divorced her a year after her disappearance, and the next year he married Joanne Curtis, his former student and lover, who had moved in with him on January 10, 1982, a day after Lynette went missing. Joanne became the stepmother of Lynette's daughters, and Chris, not wanting to traumatize the children with the stories of their mother's disappearance, told them that Joanne was their real mother. Lynette's relatives were not happy about what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. They stopped relying. Police, as they had long ago stopped investigating due to the complete lack of leads. Moreover, they didn't even try to question all of her relatives and friends, and the case was abandoned almost immediately without a proper investigation. Chris and Joanne moved to Queensland with the children, selling their old house. Chris almost completely cut ties with his former wife's relatives, only occasionally calling her mother. Later, Chris and Joanne had a daughter. 6 years passed, and during that time, Lynette never contacted anyone. This continued until 1990, when something unexpected happened. Chris and Joanne divorced, and soon after that, Joanne contacted Lynette's relatives to pass on shocking information. She said that she had suspected her husband of murdering his ex-wife all this time. According to her, a month before Lynette's disappearance, Chris had talked about hiring a hitman to get rid of her. On the very day she disappeared, he told Joanne that Lynette had left forever and would never return. She also advised the police to search the backyard of the house where Lynette and Chris lived. In 1991, the police questioned Chris. He said that his ex-wife was just trying to tarnish his name and that he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance. He admitted that the woman was intentionally doing this to get custody of their daughter after the divorce. At that time, the court was deciding who would have custody of their child, and Chris' arrest would have been beneficial to Joanne. Police seized phones from Chris and his brother, but nothing suspicious was found. So investigators once again abandoned the case, considering Joanne's words dubious. The case remained dormant for another 9 years until 2000, when police decided to excavate the backyard of Chris's old home. But there was a catch. Due to insufficient funding, they only dug around the pool area. This area was chosen after police talked to the new homeowners. According to them, during the sale, Chris persistently asked if they planned to change anything exactly in this place. The only thing that the police managed to find was a torn pink cardigan. Investigators admitted that it could have belonged to Lynette and contained some evidence, but DNA analysis found no matches with Lynette. A year later, the case was once again brought to attention. That Lynette was killed by someone she knew. Police resumed the investigation, questioning her friends and relatives, but they failed to find any leads. Only in 2003, 2 years later, investigators publicly announced that they considered Chris a suspect. They wanted to charge him with murder, but it never happened. Due to the complete lack of evidence, the man could not be convicted. But investigators managed to find many witnesses who reported that Chris and his brother regularly had intimate relationships with their school students. However, no charges were brought on this matter, and as a result, the case stalled again. In 2006, Chris claimed that he saw his wife among the extras of a series filmed in England, but no one could find any evidence to support his words. In 2010, police announced a $100,000 reward for information about Lynette's disappearance. And 4 years later, they doubled the amount. Despite the large number of appeals, this did not bring any results, and they failed to find any reliable leads. In cases where a monetary reward is promised, there are always many people who want to earn some extra money. They are ready to make up any information, just to get the money. In 2015, police dug up a section of Chris's former home, trying to find his wife's body, but they were unsuccessful. The turning point in this case came in 2018 when a podcast about Lynette's disappearance was released and gained massive popularity in Australia. Arguments were presented in favor of Lynette's husband being responsible for her murder. The podcast was listened to by several million people, which led to a wave of public outrage. Australians accused the police of negligence and demanded that the culprit be punished. The podcast's author, Hadley Thomas, spoke to Lynette's relatives and tried to find new leads. Although he was unable to find any new evidence against Chris, the public outcry was enough to initiate a new investigation. As a result, on December 5th of that year, detectives arrested Chris for the first time on charges of murder. He continued to insist on his innocence and was released on bail before the start of the trial. The wait dragged on for several years. In 2019, he appeared before a judge and claimed that he did not kill his wife and that the trial should have started in 2020. But Chris's lawyers consistently delayed the process. They insisted that due to the widespread coverage of the case in the media, their client had a biased attitude towards him. So they demanded that they abandon the jury and conduct a trial where the judge would make the decision. In May 2022, this demand was approved and the trial finally began. Chris's lawyers insisted that there was not a single piece of evidence against their clients and all the charges were based on societal bias due to the podcast. According to them, the author presented his opinion in such a way that many believed in Chris's guilt and refused to adequately evaluate the situation. Despite the lack of direct evidence on the prosecution side, they built their case on a multitude of indirect factors. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette, who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body, testified in court. And Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors who witnessed the man beating her also testified in court. They recounted that the day before Lynette's disappearance, when she returned to family therapy, she had bruises on her neck. One of the key witnesses was Joanne, who revealed that as she grew older, she realized how unhealthy her relationship with Chris was. He became obsessed with her. She was only 15 years old. He would leave notes in her backpack at school and ask her out on dates. He was persistent and didn't take no for an answer, so the young woman felt like she had nowhere to turn. According to Joanne, Chris completely controlled her life. He told her what to wear, who to talk to, and what to do. He monitored her every move and couldn't stand it when things. As a result, the woman concluded that the man could have easily killed his wife. According to the prosecution, Chris had wanted to end the marriage for a long time, but he would have lost part of his property and custody of the children in the divorce, so he decided to kill Lynette and stage her disappearance. In addition, he wanted to get rid of her so that she wouldn't interfere with his relationship with Joanne. Chris' lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that Joanne had made all of this up to intentionally slander her ex-husband. They also called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette years after her disappearance. These testimonies became the mainstay of the defense, but there was no evidence to support their claims. The prosecution believed that these testimonies were simply fabricated and that if Lynette was alive, she would have contacted her relatives and daughters over the years. As for the phone calls that Chris allegedly received in the first month of her disappearance, no evidence of their existence could be found. The prosecution argued that the woman was already dead at that time and the man made it all up to convince Lynette's relatives that she was okay. In their view, Chris killed the woman on January 9th, drove her body in an unknown direction, and hid it. Because the police were negligent in their work in those years, no proper investigation was conducted. Although the killer's motives were always obvious. The trial lasted for 10 weeks, and on August 30th, 2022, the judge found Chris guilty. A few months later, in early December, the sentence was announced: 24 years in prison, with the possibility of applying for early release after 18 years of considering that he will be 92 years old by then. Chris may simply not live to see the time. After the sentence was handed down, Lynette's relatives, including her eldest daughter, spoke. She no longer doubted that her father had killed her mother and said that his actions had destroyed her life. The woman demanded that her father confess where he had hidden Lynette's body so that the family could finally bury her. But Chris remained silent and looked at the floor while his daughter spoke. Despite the fact that almost 41 years have passed since Lynette's murder, her relatives still hope to find her remains. Chris, who is now 74 years old, continues to insist on his innocence, but even his own children do not believe him. Thus, one of Australia's most high-profile cases was solved in large part thanks to a podcast that drew the attention of millions of people to this unjust story. If the police had conducted a proper investigation from the beginning, the killer could have been punished immediately after the crime, not after 4 decades. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video. A young mother was found dead in her bedroom. From the very beginning of the investigation, detectives faced almost complete lack of evidence. However, soon the case took a very unexpected turn. As a result, they learned shocking details that changed the course of the case and allowed them to uncover the truth. Michelle Young was born on February 17, 1977 in the small American town of Sayville, New York. From an early age, the girl was characterized by perseverance and determination. She set ambitious goals for herself and made every effort to achieve them. In school, she excelled academically and was captain of the cheerleading team. She also chose a career path quite early in life. To obtain the necessary education, Michelle enrolled at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She also joined the local cheerleading team, but later decided to leave it and fully focus on her studies. For years later, she earned a master's degree, and almost immediately after that, she got a job at a local accounting company. Her position provided a decent income right from the start. She rented an apartment in a good area and devoted a large part of her time to climbing the career ladder. In February 2001, while celebrating her 24th birthday with friends, Michelle met a man named Jason. He was several years older and had graduated from the same university as her. The couple quickly found common ground and soon they started dating. Jason worked as a sales agent in a large company that produced power tools. He lived in another city, and at the time of their meeting, he was in Raleigh on business. After meeting Michelle, he started visiting there more often, and at other times, they communicated by phone. Later, he permanently moved to the city, and after some time, he and Michelle started living together. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant. The couple decided to get married. On March 29, 2004, their daughter Cassidy was born, and the family moved into a large house located in a prestigious area on the outskirts of the city. Around the same time, Michelle's sister, Meredith, moved to Raleigh and regularly helped the family take care of the child. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant again, and she and her husband decided they lived in a city called Brevard, which was 400 kilometers away from their home. Unfortunately, instead of a celebration, the trip turned into a tragedy. On the very day the couple planned to return to Raleigh, Jason and Michelle were involved in a serious accident that caused her pregnancy to be terminated. The family was devastated by the news, but just 2 months later, Michelle became pregnant again. After a while, the couple found out that they were having a boy, and they eagerly awaited his birth. On November 2, 2006, Jason left for another city for work. As a sales agent, he regularly traveled around the country for business meetings and negotiations. This time he was headed to a town called Clintwood, which was about 490 kilometers away. That day, Michelle invited her friend, Shelley, to visit. The women talked until evening, after which the friend went home. The next morning, Jason called his wife's sister, Meredith, and told her that before leaving for another city, he found some designer women's bags on an online store with a good discount and wanted to order one for Michelle as a gift for their 3rd anniversary. After his departure, he remembered that he had printed out several pages with these bags and left them on the table in his home office, and learn about the upcoming gift. So he asked her sister to go to their house and take them. Meredith agreed and came to their house at around 1 p.m. At that moment, she did not have the keys with her, and Michelle was supposed to be at work. But the woman knew that the door to their garage was broken and could be easily lifted by hand. She did just that, but immediately noticed something strange. Her sister's car was parked inside. Thinking that she had gone to work, Meredith walked into the house. Upon entering the kitchen, she saw Michelle's purse lying on the floor. The woman called her sister by name, but there was no answer. Instead, she heard their dog barking, which was also strange. When Jason and Michelle left the house, they always let the dog out into the backyard. The woman noticed something red on the floor in the bedroom. Approaching closer, she realized with horror that it was a bloodstain and next to it was her sister Michelle. She was lying face down. Meredith approached her sister and tried to turn her over but immediately felt that her sister's body was cold. The woman panicked and immediately called 911. At the same time, Cassidy, the 2-year-old girl who was hiding under the bed next to where the body lay, crawled out and ran to her aunt when she saw her. Meredith called the police and led her outside where they waited for the officers. When the woman was speaking to the operator, he asked, "Is the child okay?" Meredith examined her and found no visible injuries. The only thing she noticed was small blood stains all over the room, which she immediately realized were the child's footprints. The child was immediately handed over to the doctors for examination, and the police began to investigate the crime scene. They immediately noticed something strange. There were bloody footprints of a child all over the room. However, Kennedy's feet were completely clean. Additionally, there wasn't a single drop of blood on the girl. The footprints led to the bathroom in only one direction. Blood stains were found on the inside of the bathroom door, apparently left by the child's hand. Based on all of this, detectives constructed the most obvious version of what had happened. After the murder, the girl was locked in the bathroom for a while and then someone came in and washed Cassidy clean of blood. Later, when the police talked to Michelle's friend, they learned another interesting fact. Shelley said that they put the girl to sleep together the night before and she was wearing a diaper. However, when the victim's sister came to her house, the child was not wearing a diaper. Based on this, the investigators concluded that the same person who washed the blood off the child also removed the diaper. The detectives did not find any signs of a break-in in the house. They discovered that Michelle's 2 rings, wedding and engagement, were missing from her hand, but all other valuables were in their place, including cash, ruling out the scenario of robbery. Were found on her body and near her, and 4 DNA samples were found on the jewelry box that did not belong to Michelle or her husband. Several fingerprints were also found in the house that did not belong to anyone in their family. In the bedroom where the victim's body was found, experts discovered 2 shoe prints of American size 10 and 12 with the pattern on the soles. They were even able to determine the model of the shoes. Additionally, detectives noticed blood splatters on the door of the closet with clothing. However, the door was open and the splatters were arranged in a way that suggested the door should have been closed when they landed. On Jason's home office computer, the police found something interesting in the browsing history. Besides pages from a women's handbag store and a search for directions to Clintwood, there were several alarming search queries such as anatomy of a knockout, loss of consciousness from head trauma, and related topics. Medical experts concluded that Michelle died from a head injury inflicted by a heavy object. The perpetrator struck her over 30 times. And at the time of her death, she was 5 months pregnant and her baby did not survive the attack. The exact time of Michelle's death was not determined, but experts speculated that it most likely occurred at 5 or 6 in the morning. The brutality of the crime suggested that the perpetrator may have known the victim and harbored a strong dislike towards her. As usual, the detectives first looked into Michelle's husband. They spoke with her friends and relatives who provided them with a lot of interesting information. Their marriage was quite problematic as Jason and Michelle often argued over domestic issues. Furthermore, Jason was not happy when his wife became pregnant with their first child. He asked her to terminate the pregnancy, but Michelle refused. When Michelle became pregnant again after an accident they were involved in, Jason was once again not pleased with the news. It seemed like the couple might divorce in the foreseeable future. Meredith also told the police that Jason's request to retrieve the handbag printouts initially seemed strange to her, considering the obvious problems in their marriage, and it had already been over 3 weeks since their anniversary. However, one obvious fact contradicted the theories of Jason's involvement. At the time of the murder, he was in another city that was 490 kilometers away. And called the police. She also informed their relatives about what had happened. Michelle's mother called Jason's parents while he was on his way from Clintwood to visit them. He decided to stop by his parents' house before heading home, and upon arrival, they told him about what had happened. Jason was shocked by the news and immediately left for Raleigh with other relatives. During this trip, a friend called Jason and told him that the police were asking a lot of questions about him. Jason made a strange decision and said he didn't want to talk to the police and wanted to hire a lawyer, which only increased the investigators' suspicions but also gave them a new lead. Shelley, who was visiting the victim the day before the murder, told the police something interesting. Michelle had told her that she had been feeling like someone was constantly watching her lately. Shelley herself also felt like someone was watching them through the window that evening and even asked her friend to walk her to her car because she was a little scared to leave the house alone. Detectives tried to find any evidence related to possible surveillance but continued to investigate Jason's potential involvement. Jason left his house in his car on November 2nd in the afternoon and, considering it was about a 6-hour drive to Clintwood, decided to stop and stay at the Hampton Hotel, which is roughly halfway on the route. Detectives requested surveillance footage from this hotel and actually saw Jason check in at 10:54 p.m. and 2 minutes later he used his key card to enter his room and the card was not used again after that. The next morning around 7:40 a.m. he called his mother and the signal passed through a cell tower located near the town of Whiteville. This town was on the way from the hotel to Clintwood where his business meeting was supposed to take place. The police also found out that the meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. but Jason arrived 30 minutes late. When Jason arrived home with his relatives, the police seized his white Ford Explorer. Forensic experts could not find any blood or other evidence in it. They also examined the hotel room where the man stayed, but nothing was found there either. The same applied to all of Jason's clothing and belongings. Interesting, a pair of size 12 boots of the same brand were found in his car, the tracks of which were discovered in the house, but it was a model with a completely different pattern on the sole. A DNA sample was taken from the man by court order, which did not match the 2 hairs found. The victim's body. His fingerprints were also taken, although this was not particularly useful as they were everywhere in his home, of course. Experts could only determine that none of the fingerprints found contained traces of blood. Thus, the police were unable to find any evidence that could connect Jason to the murder. He did not speak to the police and used the services of a lawyer. When the police searched Jason's car, they found a hotel receipt and a fresh newspaper. A Hampton employee said he had slipped them under the door of his room somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. This meant that the man was definitely in the hotel that morning. In the end, a rather complex situation arose. Jason could have killed his wife only if he had left the hotel unnoticed in the middle of the night. Driven 270 kilometers to his home, committed the crime, cleaned his daughter of blood, then driven 270 kilometers back and quietly entered his room so that the electronic key did not register it. Detectives tried to figure out if this was possible in principle. They interviewed hotel staff and here they came across an interesting lead. One of the employees noticed that the fire door on the first floor was slightly open, held open by a small redstone. The employee was surprised because this door was always closed from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. He pulled out the stone from under the door and closed it. After that, the man decided to check the surveillance cameras and saw that one of them was not working. The one located on the stairwell next to the door. The employee approached it and realized that someone had disconnected the wire from the camera. He asked his colleague to return the wire to its place and around 5:50 a.m. the camera started working again. From the recordings, the detectives established that the camera was turned off at 11:19 p.m. Then something interesting happened at 6:35 a.m. Less than an hour after the camera was reconnected, it suddenly turned to face the ceiling. Given that there was no automatic mechanism to change its position, there was only one option. Someone manually turned the camera so it wouldn't face the hallway. The hotel management claimed that the camera had never been turned off before and the only time someone turned it towards the ceiling was a few years ago, when a guest wanted to leave the hotel unnoticed. This was a significant argument for the detectives that Jason could have left the hotel and gone home, then returned. The idea with the door and the camera was evident. The hotel's fire doors are designed in such a way that they can only be opened from inside the room. Jason could have used this door to leave the hotel without going through the main entrance, as he would have been seen by the employees and other cameras. Investigators interviewed all of Michelle's neighbors and interesting clues awaited them here as well. On the night of the murder, around 4 a.m., a woman was delivering fresh newspapers to their area near Michelle's house when she noticed a light-colored SUV but couldn't remember the model. Another neighbor left her work around 5:20 a.m. and also noticed a white SUV near Jason and Michelle's house. Passing by, she saw a man behind the wheel but couldn't make out his face. What was even more interesting was that there was a woman sitting next to him in the passenger seat. The neighbor thought she was trying to hide her face from her. The third witness drove past her house around 6:15 a.m. and also saw a white SUV there, but no one was inside. Detectives believed that this car belonged to Jason, but it was a complete surprise to them that there was a woman in the car with him. Attempts to identify her were unsuccessful, but during the investigation, detectives found out that the man had been cheating on his wife with her friends since college. The woman lived in Florida, and Jason regularly went to see her under the guise of business trips. Detectives also discovered that the day before Michelle's murder, the lovers had called each other about 50 times, but the content of their conversations was unknown. Despite all this, the police still had no evidence linking Jason to the murder. He still refused to talk to the police without his lawyer present, but even in the presence of the attorney, he did not answer their questions. Detectives continued to actively work on the case, and ultimately, the investigation dragged on for many months. They were almost certain that it was Jason who committed the murder, but without substantial evidence, they were not in a hurry to arrest him. This happened only on December 14, 2009, 3 years after the murder. The investigators realized they would not be able to find any new evidence. So, they gathered all the available materials and charged him with murder. The trial began 2 years later in June 2011. The prosecution insisted that Jason had premeditated the murder of his wife because he did not want to lose part of his property in the divorce. According to their version, he had initially decided to stay at that particular hotel because it would allow him to return home to commit the murder and then drive back. Former girlfriends of Jason also testified at the trial. One of them recounted that he had proposed to her and given her a ring, but later during an argument he grabbed her hand and took the ring off her finger. Given that the killer had removed the rings from Michelle's hand, these statements seemed significant to the prosecution. And another woman turned out to be Jason's second mistress and a friend of Michelle. She revealed that she spent time with the man at his home when Michelle went somewhere. She was also married, and on one of those nights Jason removed her engagement ring from her finger. He did not return it until the next day, which seemed strange to the woman. Another mistress, a college friend of Michelle, also testified at the trial. She admitted that they had a romance. But the prints of their correspondence turned out to be much more interesting. Just a few days before the murder, he wrote to her, "I don't know how it all turned out this way, but I know how it will all end, with 2 broken hearts, but I don't care. I have a lot of suffering ahead of me, but you are worth it, even if only for a moment." Given that Michelle was killed just a few days after this message, its content was very disturbing. But one of the main witnesses was a woman who worked at a gas station between Raleigh and the town where Jason's hotel was located. She recounted that around 5:20 a.m. a man in a white SUV pulled up to the farthest pump. He tried to fill his car, but by law, people had to pay for gas first or show their ID at night. The driver went then threw $20 at her, filled the car with $15 worth of gas, and drove away without taking the change. The woman claimed to recognize this man from the photo. It was Jason Young. This witness changed the course of the case as, thanks to her, it became known that Jason was between his home and the hotel early in the morning. This once again pointed to the fact that he could have killed his wife. At the trial, Michelle's sister, Meredith, also testified. After Michelle's murder, her daughter, Cassidy, stayed with her father, who moved in with his parents. For a long time, Michelle's relatives tried to obtain a court decision allowing them to take the girl to live with them temporarily. This went on for several years, and the lawyers were close to obtaining a positive decision when Jason simply relinquished full custody of Meredith, practically abandoning her. As a result, the girl moved in with her mother's relatives, who had been raising her without her father's involvement since then. Jason spoke for the first time at the trial, telling his version of events and denying that he killed his wife. He admitted that their marriage was falling apart, but insisted that they would have eventually divorced and he had no motive to kill her. His lawyers argued that there was no evidence against Jason and also tried to convince everyone that he could not physically have driven such a distance to kill his wife and return to the hotel early in the morning. They tried to calculate the average fuel consumption of his car and compare it with data on how often he refueled. According to the lawyers, he would not have had enough fuel to make the trip. It was not possible. Nonetheless, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision, and the judge was forced to declare a mistrial and schedule a new one for a year later. Against this backdrop, something else important happened. Michelle's relatives were convinced that Jason killed her, so they decided to file a civil lawsuit against him. Unlike in criminal trials, the required level of evidence for such lawsuits is lower, and the judge cannot sentence a person to prison. Jason completely ignored this lawsuit and decided not to participate in the process, which worked against him. After examining all the available evidence, the judge concluded that he was the one who killed his wife, and Jason was ordered to pay $15 million to Michelle's relatives. In the retrial, which began in 2012, the prosecution was allowed to use the decision in the civil lawsuit as an argument in favor of the suspect's guilt. In addition, they discovered something else during the preparation. It turned out that a year before Jason's murder, he had bought boots with the same pattern, the bloody imprint of which was left in Michelle's room, but they had not been able to find those shoes. These additional factors only strengthened the case against Jason. And this time, the jury found him guilty of murder. The man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His lawyers tried to challenge the decision, and they continue to file appeals to this day. But all of them are rejected. This case was widely covered in the media, and its finale sparked heated discussions. On the one hand, over all these years, no physical evidence has been found that would connect Jason to the murder. On the other hand, a huge range of circumstantial evidence indicated that the man had orchestrated almost a perfect cover-up. If he had not stopped at the gas station that morning and had not caused a scene with the cashier, she might not have remembered his face. In that case, this case would still remain unsolved. As for the woman who was seen by a neighbor in the passenger seat of his car that night, everything is very ambiguous. There are no other clues that would indicate the involvement of other people in this crime. Other people's hair and DNA in the house did not guarantee this. It could have been left by one of the guests long before the murder. Nevertheless, the prosecution did not rule out 100% that someone could have helped Jason, but this moment remains a mystery. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. A woman was found dead in her own home, and the police quickly solved the case. But what happened next is more reminiscent of a twisted detective movie than a real-life story. There are so many unexpected twists and shocking moments in this case that it is rightfully considered one of the most intriguing in history. Donna Brown was born on November 10, 1963 in Miami. She grew up in a large and friendly family with two younger sisters whom she had along with very well. When Donna was young, her parents divorced and she remained living with her mother. Despite this, her father remained actively involved in his daughters' lives and they remained quite close. After finishing school, Donna received medical training and became a surgical assistant at a local hospital. Her colleagues quickly grew to love her because she took her work seriously and was also a kind and open person. Her life was going quite well, but Donna wanted to start her own family for complete happiness. In the late 1980s, Donna went on a date with a man named Mark Winger, and she almost immediately knew she had met her match. Mark was charming and intelligent, worked as a nuclear engineer, and dreamed of having a large family. They began dating and decided to get married in 1989. Shortly after that, Mark received a job offer at a nuclear facility in Springfield, Illinois. It was a big step up the career ladder for him, and he and Donna decided to move there. The couple settled in a nice neighborhood, and soon after the move, Donna got a job at a local hospital. They only lacked children for complete happiness, but all their attempts were unsuccessful. At some point, Donna learned that she was medically unable to conceive, and it was a devastating blow for her. Both she and Mark dreamed of a large family, and all the conditions of their lives were favorable for it. But fate decided otherwise. Then the couple began to consider adoption but kept postponing this serious step. This continued until 1995, when everything changed in one day. A pregnant underage girl was admitted to the hospital where Donna worked, and she wanted to give her child to a loving family. Mark and Donna immediately decided to adopt the baby. In June, right after the birth, they adopted a girl and named her Bailey Elizabeth Winger. The day they took her home coincided with the anniversary of their engagement. The couple and all the relatives were happy that they finally had a child. In August of the same year, Donna went to Florida with her 3-month-old daughter to visit her parents and introduce them to their granddaughter. The family had a great time, and sometime later, the woman returned home. She flew to the nearest airport, which was 2 hours away from Springfield, and then hired a taxi to her city through a special company. This trip greatly spoiled Donna's mood because the driver behaved quite inadequately. The whole way he talked about how several personalities lived in him, and they forced him to do various terrible things, such as killing people. In addition, the driver talked about how he regularly participated in orgies and even invited Donna to participate in them. The man also constantly violated traffic rules and drove the car quite dangerously. When Donna got home, she told her husband about it, and he was furious. Mark called the company the driver worked for and demanded that he be fired. It turned out that the driver was 27-year-old Roger Harrington. The management decided to suspend him from work, but that wasn't the end of it. During the next week, an unknown man called Winger's home phone, refused to identify himself, and asked for Donna. She and her husband suspected that the caller was Roger, and she was seriously concerned about her safety. Given that the man knew their home address, she was afraid that Roger might harm her. A distress call was made to the Springfield Police Department. Mark Winger was in a panic and reported that an unknown man had broken into their home and attacked Donna with a hammer. Mark, shocked and terrified, took his gun and shot the intruder. When the officers arrived at the scene, they found 2 bodies on the floor with Mark in a state of panic. The police officers detected a faint pulse from both individuals on the floor and called an ambulance while trying to obtain information from Mark about what had happened. Although Mark could barely speak, the detectives managed to piece together a rough idea of what had occurred. Mark explained that he was using the treadmill in the basement when he heard a noise upstairs. He went upstairs to the main floor and found his 3-month-old daughter unattended on the bed. When he went to another room, he saw an unknown man attacking his wife with a hammer. Mark panicked and grabbed his gun, shooting the attacker before calling the police. While waiting for the ambulance, one of the officers found a wallet in the attacker's jacket with documents belonging to a Roger Harrington. The detective knew this person well. Roger lived in a trailer park in Springfield and had a criminal history mostly related to minor offenses. He also had mental health issues and was generally known to be quite aggressive. Both Roger and Donna were taken to the hospital where they died without regaining consciousness. Meanwhile, the police examined the crime scene, collecting evidence. Next to the bodies was a bloodied hammer, while Mark's gun was found on a table nearby along with a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee. Mark told the detectives that the cigarettes and coffee were likely brought by the killer. The hammer was from his tool set as he was planning to hang some pictures that day, so he prepared it and left it in the living room. Near the Wingers' home, Roger's car was found and detectives discovered a note inside. It contained Donna's home address, Mark's name, and the time for 30 p.m. When asked if he knew the attacker, Mark initially denied it, but when the police mentioned Roger's name, Mark realized with horror that the driver was the same person. He told the detectives the story of how they knew Roger, his strange behavior towards Donna, and the creepy calls to their home number. The investigators spoke with acquaintances and relatives of Donna who were aware of her fears. She had repeatedly complained to them that she was seriously concerned about Roger and was afraid that he might come to her house one day and seek revenge because he lost his job after she complained to their superiors. Donna even wrote down all the details of her trip with Roger on a piece of paper in case she had to go to the police. The police found this paper at their house, and the investigation lasted for 2 days before the case was closed. No charges were brought against Mark for shooting Roger, because his actions were classified as self-defense. He continued to be in a state of shock, and his relatives flew to Springfield to support him and help take care of his daughter. Donna's relatives also provided him with all kinds of assistance. Months went by, and Mark continued to struggle with the loss of his wife, and his family began to notice negative changes in his behavior. He began drinking heavily, although he had never consumed alcohol before these events. He also often visited local bars. His relatives tried to support him in every way possible and help take care of Bailey, but ultimately they had to return to their own cities. Donna's parents understood that it would be difficult for Mark to take care of his daughter, so they suggested finding a nanny. In the end, Mark hired a woman named Rebecca Hondet, who specialized in round-the-clock childcare, so she spent most of her time at their house. Rebecca took care of the girl and got along great with her. Mark gradually began to recover, stopped drinking, and returned to work. This went on for several months, and during this time, a romance developed between him and Rebecca. She hardly ever left his house, and they spent time together with Bailey, constantly communicating, and eventually this lent a mutual sympathy. Rebecca also sincerely loved the girl, and a strong bond was formed between them. In 1996, a woman became pregnant, and Mark was given another chance to start a big and strong family. Rebecca also wanted this, and the couple got married in October. Mark and Donna's relatives were surprised that he started a new relationship just a few months after his wife's death, but ultimately supported him, as the new family was beneficial not only to him but also to Bailey. All the relatives sympathized with Rebecca, seeing her sincere love and care for the girl. Mark decided to sell his house because it constantly reminded him of Donna's death, and after what had happened, he did not want to raise children there. He and Rebecca decided to buy a house with a large plot of land outside the city, renovated it, and moved to a new house, and started to build their new life. Soon they had a daughter, and over the next few years, they had another daughter and a son. Thus, Mark and Rebecca raised 4 children, and the man's dream of a large family came true. Over time, Mark became more distant from Donna's relatives who tried to be present in their granddaughter's life. The problem was that Bailey didn't remember Donna at all and considered Rebecca her mother. Mark didn't want the girl to know about the tragic pasts of their family from an early age, and ultimately he forbade Donna's parents from calling her their granddaughter. They tried to persuade him, but in the end, they gave up all attempts. The relatives understood that it might be better for the girl to grow up away from what had happened. In the following years, Mark and Rebecca happily lived in their new home, raised their children, and made plans for the future. The tragedy of the past gradually faded, but its echoes continue to haunt the family. In 1999, Mark decided to sue the company that hired Roger Harrington as a driver. In Mark's opinion, this company did not make any effort to check this person's sanity, and as a result, it led to the murder of his wife. The company did not want to admit its guilt, and Mark hired a lawyer. To determine their guilt, the court decided to study all the materials of the case and the evidence, which were handed over to the lawyers. While they were preparing for the trial, something completely unexpected happened. In February of the same year, a woman named Deanne Schultz came to the police and told detectives a shocking story. Deanne was Donna's best friend and worked with her at the hospital. When Donna had a child, Deanne actively helped her take care of the girl, but Deanne's story turned everything upside down. She confessed to the police that she had been having an affair with Mark for several months, which they had kept hidden from their spouses. It all started 3 months before Donna's death. Around the same time, the couple adopted a daughter. Mark and Deanne were secretly seeing each other, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. The woman told detectives that Mark wanted to get rid of his wife to be with her. One day he said it would be so much easier if Donna just died. He then began to persuade Deanne to help him with a plan, but he did not reveal the details. Mark said that all Deanne needed to do was go to their house, find his wife's body, and call the police. The woman thought Mark couldn't be serious and was just joking, but he continued to share troubling things with her. After Donna complained to him about Roger Harrington's behavior, he told Deanne about it and said he had planned to frame the driver. He added that he just needed to figure out how to lure him into the house. A week before the murder, he called Deanne and asked if she would still love him no matter what, to which she answered yes. A few days after Donna's murder, friends and family gathered at their house to support Mark. When he was alone with Deanne, he said, "It seems like the police believe me, I did it for us." The woman was shocked, but Mark demanded that she not tell anyone, and she obeyed. They continued to secretly see each other and even exchanged rings, planning to get married in the foreseeable future. But in the following months, Mark started a romantic relationship with the nanny and eventually broke up with Deanne. She was devastated. She had kept this terrible secret from Mark and he had traded her for someone else. Deanne never dared to tell the police about everything, realizing that part of the blame was her. Over the next few years, the woman repeatedly tried to take her own life, and only after 3.5 years did she finally overcome herself and go to the police station. The detectives were completely shocked. All this time, Mark had been considered a victim and even a hero who tried to save his beloved wife from a terrible killer. But Diane's story from a completely different angle. The investigators decided to re-examine the evidence, but they were met with an unpleasant surprise. All of it had been handed over to lawyers who were preparing Mark's case against the transportation company. It would take time to retrieve them, but some materials from the case remained at the station. The photographs from the crime scene, the lead detective looked at them and realized with horror that they had missed some obvious things all these years. The investigation had been quickly closed after the murder as no one doubted Roger's guilt. But now, as the detective saw these photos for the first time, he realized that the positioning of the bodies did not match Mark's story at all. He had told them that when he entered the room, Donna was lying on the floor and was striking her with a hammer from above, and then he shot him and Roger fell next to the woman. In reality, however, his body was lying in the opposite direction and he physically could not have fallen in that direction. The detective realized that Mark's story was a lie, and it made him rethink a whole series of moments that now made much more sense. First of all, no one ever figured out how Roger got into the house. There were no signs of a break-in, and Donna certainly would not have opened the door for him. But if you remember the note inside Roger's car, everything falls into place. It had Mark's name and the time, which looked like a reminder of a meeting. Remembering Deanne's story, detective concluded that Mark had somehow invited Roger to their home on some pretext and let him in, after which he shot him. Secondly, in Roger's car they found a knife and several other items that he could have used for the murder, but he did not take them with him and used Mark's hammer, which the man took out of the closet on that very day and left in plain sight. All of this sounded completely illogical if you assume that Roger came to the house to kill someone. Moreover, he left a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee on their table. A very strange thing for a person who came there to kill. The detective listened to the recording of the 911 call made by Mark and was once again shocked. Mark told the operator that he had shot the attacker once, after which there was a male mumble in the background as if someone was trying to speak. Mark told the operator that his daughter was crying and he needed to go to her, after which she hung up. However, there is no hint of a child's crying on the recording. A more realistic scenario was that Mark did not shoot Roger once, and on hearing the gunshot, Donna ran to him and her husband hit her with a hammer. After that, he called the police and pretended to be panicked, reporting what had happened. Suddenly, Roger woke up and tried to say something, and those sounds were recorded on the call. Mark lied about his daughter crying, hung up, and shot Roger again. In support of this version, there was another fact that the investigators completely ignored. Mark and Donna's neighbors said during the questioning that they heard 2 shots. However, about 5 minutes had passed with Mark's story but completely matched the more realistic version in which he was the killer. But that wasn't all. During the initial investigation, which lasted only 2 days, the experts did not even examine the evidence. However, now that Mark decided to sue the transportation company, they hired lawyers and were going to win this case. The lawyers requested an independent examination of the clothing of all 3 participants in those events. The results spoke for itself. Blood spatters and traces indicated that Mark's story had nothing to do with reality. According to him, Roger was hitting Donna with a hammer, but there was not a drop of her blood on his clothes, not even the smallest, while there was plenty of blood from his wife on Mark's clothes, which directly indicated that he was not a real man, that he had killed his wife. The police took the evidence from the lawyers and conducted their own analysis, which showed exactly the same result. In the end, the police reopened the investigation, but this time it was about a double murder in which Mark became a suspect. His family was in shock. No one believed that the man was capable of such a brutal crime. Donna's relatives were skeptical of the suspicions against Mark until they heard all the information that the detective said uncovered. The only ones who insisted on Roger's innocence from the first day were his friends and family members. They were all aware of his minor criminal history but did not believe he was capable of murder. Moreover, their neighbor Roger, with whom they shared a rental, initially gave the police important information that they overlooked. Immediately after the murder, the detectives questioned the man and he told them that the day before, Roger received a call, hung up and wrote down Mark Winger's name, address and time on a piece of paper. It all looked as if Mark had scheduled a meeting with him, but the police did not attach much importance to it. Rebecca experienced the greatest shock from the whole situation. She knew Mark as a loving and caring father who had never shown any aggression during their time together. She refused to believe that this person could beat his wife with a hammer and frame someone else. After several weeks of investigation, the police decided to arrest Mark and he was arrested right at work. The case was sent to court. Mark was granted a $1 million bail. He could not raise that amount, so he remained in custody, awaiting trial. The trial did not begin until 3 years later, in May 2002. All his close ones and even Donna's relatives hoped that this would be a big misunderstanding and that the court would prove Mark's innocence. None of them were prepared for the opposite, and his lawyers insisted on the truthfulness of Mark's version. They noted that the crime scene photos could have been taken after the medics moved Roger's body, considering that the doctor's actions were not documented. It was possible to prove or disprove this possibility. In addition, the lawyers emphasized Roger's criminal history, his mental problems, and his inappropriate behavior with Donna during the trip. Deanne Schultz became the main witness in this case. By law, she could have been punished for keeping Mark's secret all these years, but the judge decided to grant her full immunity in exchange for her testimony. The male lawyers tried to discredit Deanne in every possible way, pointing out that she had attempted suicide multiple times, which could indicate psychological problems. The defense also suggested that she had made it all out of jealousy, seeking revenge on Mark. The prosecution insisted that the evidence and Deanne's testimony unequivocally pointed to his guilt. As for motive, it lay in the mistress's story. Mark lost interest in Donna long before they adopted Bailey. He'd been having secret affairs with her best friend, but he could not divorce Donna because he would have to split their expensive home and other assets, which was unacceptable to him. After Roger gave Donna a ride from the airport, Mark saw the perfect opportunity and decided to act. As terrible as it sounds, Mark was lucky. He encountered a man with a criminal record and mental illness who claimed to hear voices telling him to kill people. After Roger complained to management, he lost his job, which became the perfect motive when both the prosecution and defense laid their cards on the table, leaving only the jury's decision to wait for. Despite the compelling evidence against Mark, there were still doubts about his guilt among both his family members and on his relatives. None of them could imagine a loving father and respected member of society as a killer. Nevertheless, the jury unanimously found him guilty of the double murder. In the end, Mark received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and Roger was posthumously exonerated. Rebecca could not believe that her husband had actually killed Donna. It took her a long time to impartially consider all the evidence of his guilt until she finally came to terms with the fact that he was truly a murderer. The chief detectives apologized repeatedly to Donna's and Roger's families for the sloppy initial investigation. He admitted his guilt in accepting the most logical version of events as the only correct one, overlooking all the contradictions. If you think that's the end of the story, then I have another unexpected turn for you. Even after the conviction, many doubted whether Mark had actually done it. But in 2006, those doubts were dispelled. In Mark's prison cell, they found 19 pages of handwritten text in which he was plotting to kill Deanne and another person. Mark wanted to hire a hitman straight from prison through other inmates or people on the outside. His desire to kill Deanne was understandable. He wanted to avenge the woman for revealing all his secrets to the police. The second person on the list was a man named Jeffrey Gelman, his childhood friend. Detectives quickly discovered the reason for such a decision. Mark asked him for $1 million bail, but the friend refused to provide such a sum. From these handwritten pages, it fell that Mark wanted to kidnap the man to get a solid ransom for him and then kill him. Why he needed money for life imprisonment was unclear. Perhaps he planned to eventually get out or escape. But in the end, the man faced another trial and received an additional 35 years in prison for planning a double murder. After that, no one doubted that Mark was the one who killed Donna. Rebecca raised 4 children alone, and they all know what kind of monster their father is. They changed their last names and do not plan to communicate with Mark. In 2019, Rebecca decided that Bailey should renew contact with Donna's relatives who had not seen her since she was 3 years old. Bailey was already 24 at the time, and she went to Florida and had a great time with them. They still communicate, and the young woman learns more about Donna from them. As for Mark, he is still in prison and denies his guilt. Perhaps he would never have been held accountable for what he did if it weren't for 2 factors that happened almost simultaneously. The first is the testimony of his former mistress. She could no longer keep this secret, especially watching how the killer creates a new family and raises children. The second factor is Mark's greed. Almost 4 years after the murder, he decided to sue his employer, Roger Harrington, for a substantial sum, even though he was earning very good money himself. He did not expect third-party experts to study the evidence much more carefully than the local detectives. Interestingly, Diane decided to turn to the police, including after learning about this lawsuit. It became one of the last straws, and the woman revealed Mark's terrible secret. Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. The student returned home after a walk with friends. A few minutes later, she called her boyfriend with a worried voice and said that someone had come to her apartment. After that, she promised to call him back and hung up. But the call never came, and he decided to go to her house. What happened next turned into a long and complicated investigation, with the final point being made. Only 26 years later, Angela Samota was born on September 19, 1964, in Alameda, California. She was the youngest of 5 children. When she was 1 year old, her father died and her mother raised them alone. After graduating from high school in 1982, Angela enrolled at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. She chose the Department of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering, which was not the most popular direction for young women at the time. Because of this, Angela was one of the few young women in her class, but this did not prevent her from studying excellently and moving towards her chosen career. Angela also had many friends, and later she started dating a guy named Ben McCall. He was several years older than her and worked in a managerial position at a construction company. During the first few years of study, Angela lived in a dormitory, and during this time, she and her roommate, Sheila, became best friends. At some point, Angela decided to rent an apartment near the university and chose a residential complex 5 minutes from the campus. In addition, she got a part-time job to cover the rental expenses. On the Friday evening of October 12, 1984, Angela decided to go to a bar with her friends. The young woman also invited her boyfriend, but he had to go to work the next morning, so he declined. As a result, Angela went with her friend Anita and their mutual acquaintance named Russell. They visited several bars and had a great time, after which they decided to go home around 1 a.m. Since Angela hardly drank alcohol, she agreed to drive her friends home. First, they dropped off Russell near his apartment. Anita originally wanted to stay overnight at Angela's, but she planned to attend a football match early in the morning, so Anita asked to be taken to the dormitory. After that, Angela decided to stop by her boyfriend's house for a few minutes. She went in for a few minutes and then went home. Her apartment was just a few blocks away from Ben's home. After saying goodbye to Angela, he went to bed. But he woke up 10 minutes later from a call on his home phone. It was Angela on the other end, and her voice sounded very worried. At first, she just asked him to talk to her, which seemed strange to him. He could hear some noise in the background and tried to find out from her what was going on. Soon she told him that some man knocked on her door and asked to use her phone and bathroom. Angela did not specify whether she let him in voluntarily or the man entered the apartment without her permission. She asked Ben, "Are there any convenience stores nearby with a payphone?" The guy looked up a suitable store in the directory and gave her the address. She repeated this information to the man and told Ben that she would call him back soon and hung up. But the call never. Ben started calling her himself, but there was no answer. Then he got into his car and drove to her apartment. When he arrived at the house, he started knocking on her door, but there was only silence and response. Ben had a portable phone in his car that was given to him by the construction company. He dialed Angela's home number and walked back to her apartment. He heard the phone ringing, but no one answered. But then he thought that the young woman might have escorted the stranger to the convenience store with a payphone and decided to go there. But the salesperson said that no one had come to them, and Ben returned to Angela's apartment. He knocked on the door again and decided to call the police. It was almost half an hour before 2 policemen arrived at the house. Ben explained the situation to them and asked to open the door to Angela's apartment. But the officers did not rush to take any active action. They decided to contact the manager of the residential complex and ask him for a key before entering the apartment. The first thing the police officer saw was a shoe on the floor in the middle of the living room. Then they headed to the bedroom where they saw a horrifying sight. Angela was lying in bed, surrounded by a lot of blood, and she was not wearing any clothes. The police officers immediately noticed multiple stab wounds on her body. Later, experts counted 18 injuries. Investigators started examining the crime scene and noticed several bloodstains in the bathroom, presuming that they could belong to the attacker. In addition, several fingerprints were found in the apartment, but they did not lead to any results. Detectives also determined that the perpetrator had taken a kitchen knife, which was presumably the murder weapon. There were no signs of a break-in, indicating that the victim had let the attacker in, which matched Ben's story about the strange phone call. Medical experts determined that the victim had been assaulted, and they were able to extract biological material from the attacker. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not yet conducted in 1984, so the experts were only able to determine the attacker's blood type. Investigators began searching for a suspect, exploring all possible lines of investigation. First, they looked into all the employees of the residential complex who could have had access to the apartment. They then looked into men who had previously been convicted of violent crimes and lived in the area. But this also did not yield any results. Next, they focused on Angela's acquaintances and first interrogated her boyfriend. He told them about the phone call and the unknown man who came to see Angela. However, the detectives did not immediately believe him and considered the possibility that Ben may have killed her and made up the story. Nevertheless, the boyfriend agreed to provide his fingerprints and a blood sample. The experts determined his blood group was a fake, which did not match the killer's blood group. After talking to the victim's friends, the investigators identified another suspect, her ex-boyfriend, who she had dated in her own town. According to her friends, he sometimes behaved aggressively and once even threatened her with a knife. His blood group did not match the killer's blood group, and he was no longer considered a suspect. The next suspect was Russell, who had spent time with Angela a few hours before her death. And here, the police received their first alarm. They could not locate him on the day after the murder. Digging deeper, they found out that on the morning of October 13th, Russell attended a wedding of acquaintances, after which he flew to another city to visit relatives. When he returned home the next day, he was taken to the police station for questioning. The young man insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder, but investigators doubted his sincerity. Russell lived alone and couldn't confirm that he was in his apartment that night. Additionally, detectives learned that Russell had a crush on Angela. He was several years older than her and worked as an architect. They met through mutual friends shortly before her death, and Russell tried to ask her out on a date, but she told him she had a boyfriend and they continued to communicate as friends. Detectives were also suspicious of the fact that Russell left town almost immediately after the murder. Given all of this, he quickly became the prime suspect. However, there were discrepancies in the new version of his involvement. According to Ben's story, an unfamiliar man came to Angela's. Considering the timeline of events, no one else could have killed her and left the apartment. However, detectives did not base their investigation solely on Ben's story, as they simply could not confirm it. In the following weeks, Russell was called in for questioning repeatedly, and each time investigators became more convinced of his possible involvement. Some detectives even privately spoke with near certainty that he was the killer. Sheila, Angela's best friend, was deeply affected by the news of her death. She was so afraid to be alone that she had to move in with her parents. And for the first month after the murder, she even slept in the same room as them. At the same time, she almost constantly followed the progress of the investigation, constantly calling detectives and meeting with investigators. Sheila told them about Angela's friends and acquaintances, hoping to help get to the truth. During one of these meetings, a detective told her that Russell was most likely the killer, but they didn't have enough evidence to hold him accountable. He then asked Sheila to meet with him and ask him a series of friendly questions, such as, "What were you doing a few days before and after the murder?" Match what he told them. A hidden microphone was attached to Sheila before the meeting. The young man told Sheila the same story, but the detectives didn't plan on giving up. They called him in for questioning again at the station and offered to conduct a polygraph test. Russell agreed and successfully passed it, but the investigators continued to consider him the murderer. They were so convinced of their rightness that during the interrogation they showed the boy photos of Angela's body, hoping that this gruesome sight would break him. But all of this yielded no results, and Russo continued to insist on his innocence. After 6 months of constant questioning, he hired a lawyer to investigate the case. Lawyer and refused to communicate with the police personally. After that, detectives placed him under round-the-clock surveillance, but eventually had to switch their attention to searching for other suspects. Russell left for London to receive additional education in architecture, and the investigators lost the ability to monitor him during all that time. The Angela case was actively covered in the media, and her relatives offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that could help find the killer, but this also yielded no results. During the investigation, the police had another suspect, a student at the same university as Angela. Investigators received an unconfirmed lead that this guy allegedly had a crush on the young woman and wrote her angry letters a few weeks before the murder. However, the detectives were unable to confirm any of this, and the young man had a reliable alibi. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years, with no new leads appearing for the police and all the old leads leading nowhere. After 10 years of silence, Sheila decided to call the police station and inquire about the progress of the investigation. By that time, she had already gotten married and had 2 children. Despite the fact that her life continued, she could not forget the tragic fate of her best friend and the fact that the guilty party still had not been punished. She spoke with the detectives, but they said that there had been no developments in the case. Sheila asked, have they tried to extract DNA samples from the killer's biological material? After all, it was already 1994 and DNA analysis technology was actively used by the police. However, investigators stated that the evidence in this case had been lost and could not be recovered. Sheila was not satisfied with these answers and continued to regularly call the detectives. Over the course of several years, she made over 700 calls, but each time she received generic responses. She even tried to independently pay for DNA analysis of all remaining evidence in a private laboratory, but was not allowed to do so. The problem was that she had no connection to the police and was an ordinary citizen, so her initiative was not taken seriously. Then Sheila came up with an idea. She thought about obtaining a private detective license. In her opinion, this would allow her to have more useful influence on the course of the investigation. And she began to study this issue. The woman began to study hard, and after several months, she successfully passed the exam and obtained her license. Despite this, she was unable to convince the investigators to reopen the case. She continued to make regular calls until July 2006. to a new unit specializing in unsolved murders. Sheila met with the chief detective and they began to work on the case together. To her surprise, she learned that the DNA sample from the victim's body had not actually disappeared and had been in the laboratory all these years. Apparently, she had been intentionally lied to because she had tired the investigators with her calls. Sheila convinced the new detective to send the DNA sample for analysis, and it finally happened. However, due to queues and bureaucracy, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results. On February 14, 2008, the detective received the DNA profile of the killer and entered it into the FBI database. He immediately saw a 100% match. And after 24 years, they had the killer's name. When the detective called Sheila and told her about it, she expected to hear that Russell was the killer after all. But to her surprise, the detective gave her an entirely unfamiliar name. The DNA from Angela's body matched the sample of a certain Donald Andrew Bess. The man, who was already over 60 at the time, was imprisoned for a series of rapes. In 1977, Donald abducted a young woman and subjected her to violence, for which he received 25 years in prison. As is often the case, he was released early. He was released from prison after 7 years in the beginning of 1984 when he was 36 years old. In that same year, he killed Angela and remained unpunished for decades. In 1985, he assaulted another woman and was caught by the police. The fact that he was on parole at the time of the crime became an aggravating factor, and Donald was sentenced to life imprisonment. Thus, he ended up in prison a year after Angela's murder. After gathering all the necessary information, detectives came to the correctional facility to conduct an interrogation. Donald denied his involvement in Angela's murder and insisted that he had never harmed women. Of course, the investigators were not quick to believe him, as his semen was found on the victim's body. But the man was not eager to give a confession, and the case began to be prepared for trial. The start of the trial had to be postponed due to serious health problems Donald had. A few days before the hearing, he had a heart attack. As a result, the trial began only on June 2, 2010. That he had not killed anyone, but the DNA test results spoke for themselves. His lawyer tried to emphasize his health problems and good behavior in prison in order to secure a lighter sentence for Donald. The prosecution, in turn, asked for the death penalty. According to the investigators, Donald noticed Angela in one of the bars or on the street, after which he began to follow her. He knocked on her apartment door and asked to use the phone and the toilet. After the young woman called her boyfriend and hung up, Donald attacked her and assaulted her. Detectives believe that the criminal was still in Angela's apartment when her boyfriend arrived and started knocking on the door. And Donald may have been afraid that his victim would scream. So he inflicted multiple stab wounds. After waiting for her boyfriend to leave, he left the apartment. The trial was heavily covered in the news, and this led to some unexpected consequences. Several women immediately went to the police and said that Donald Bess had subjected them to violence at different times. One of them was his ex-wife, who told the court about constant beatings from Donald. He raised his hand on her even when she was pregnant with his child, and after the birth of their daughter, he continued to physically abuse her. The wife had to run away and hide, fearing for the life of her child. As a result, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Angela and he was sentenced to death. He attempted to appeal the court's decision several times, but failed. Donald spent 12 more years in prison, and during that time, his execution date was never set. However, in October 2022, he died a natural death, another heart attack. Fatal. Thus, this complicated case came to an end. Investigators acknowledged that Sheila played a crucial role in moving the investigation forward by not giving up in her pursuit of the truth. After her story was publicized, relatives of other victims whose cases had gone unsolved for years began to reach out to her. As a result, Sheila decided to help these people and established a non-profit organization. Regarding Russell, the police department officially apologized to him for the months of persecution. He admitted that it had significantly affected his life and he was genuinely afraid of being convicted of a crime he did not commit. Despite this, he continued to try to help the police get to the bottom of the case. After all of these events, he became a well-known architect in Dallas. One aspect of the story that still troubles investigators is the possibility that Donald may have had many more victims even though he spent half of his life in prison. Perhaps sooner or later, they will be able to link him to other crimes. Please share your thoughts on the story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.